The morning sun cast long shadows across the tranquil waters of Pearl Harbor, as Seaman First Class James Rasmussen adjusted his white sailor's cap and gazed out at the impressive fleet anchored in the Hawaiian Naval Base. It was Sunday, December 7th, 1941, and the young sailor from Minnesota had planned to spend his day off writing letters home and perhaps catching a movie at the base theater. The air was warm and humid, carrying the sweet scent of tropical flowers that reminded him how far he was from the snow-covered fields of his childhood. Battleship Row stretched before him like a testament to American naval power. The mighty USS Arizona sat proudly alongside her sister ships, their massive 16-inch guns pointing skyward in silent vigil. Nearby, the USS Oklahoma rocked gently in the harbor's embrace, while the USS West Virginia and USS Tennessee completed the formidable line of battleships that represented the backbone of the Pacific Fleet. The sight never failed to inspire awe in the young seaman, who had joined the Navy just 18 months earlier with dreams of seeing the world and serving his country. Admiral Husband Kimmel, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, had spent the previous evening reviewing intelligence reports in his headquarters overlooking the harbor. The tension between the United States and Japan had been escalating for months, with diplomatic negotiations reaching a critical impasse over Japan's aggressive expansion in China and Southeast Asia. Emperor Hirohito's forces had been steadily advancing across the Pacific, creating what many military analysts called an inevitable collision course with American interests in the region. According to historical records from the National Archives, intelligence officers had intercepted various Japanese communications in the weeks leading up to the attack. Though the specific target and timing remained unclear, Captain Mervyn Bennion stood on the bridge of the USS West Virginia, sipping his morning coffee and observing the routine Sunday activities across the harbor. Church services were beginning on several ships, and he could hear the faint sound of hymns drifting across the water. The captain, a veteran of 24 years of naval service, had an uneasy feeling that he couldn't quite shake. The international situation was deteriorating rapidly, and he had noticed increased submarine activity in recent reconnaissance reports. Lieutenant Commander Logan Ramsey was reviewing flight schedules at Ford Island when his attention was drawn to an unusual formation of aircraft approaching from the north. At first glance, they appeared to be part of a scheduled training exercise, but something about their flight pattern seemed irregular. The formation was too tight, too purposeful for a routine training mission on a Sunday morning. Meanwhile, Private Joseph Lockard and Private George Elliott were manning the mobile radar station at Opana Point on the northern tip of Oahu. Their shift was supposed to end at 7 o'clock that morning, but they had decided to continue operating the equipment for additional practice. At approximately 7:02, Elliott noticed a large formation of aircraft on the radar screen, approaching from the northeast at a distance of 137 miles. The blips were unlike anything they had seen during their training exercises. The two privates debated whether to report the unusual reading. Lockard, who had more experience with the radar equipment, estimated there were more than 50 aircraft in the formation. Elliott suggested they contact the information center at Fort Shafter, but Lockard initially hesitated, thinking it might be a scheduled flight of American bombers expected to arrive from the mainland. The decision to make that phone call would prove to be one of the most significant moments in American military history, though its importance would only become clear in the hours that followed. As the morning sun climbed higher in the Pacific sky, casting brilliant reflections across the harbor's surface, none of the men at Pearl Harbor could have imagined that they were living through the final moments of American neutrality in the greatest conflict the world had ever known. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida adjusted his flight goggles as he led the first wave of 183 Japanese aircraft toward their target. The veteran pilot, hand-picked by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto to lead this audacious mission, felt the weight of his nation's destiny in his hands. Below him, the Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly, its blue surface broken only by occasional whitecaps that caught the early morning light. The formation consisted of 49 high-level bombers, 40 torpedo bombers, 51 dive bombers, and 43 Zero fighters, all launched from 6 aircraft carriers positioned 200 miles north of Oahu. The planning for this operation, codenamed Operation Z by the Japanese Imperial Navy, had taken months of meticulous preparation. Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of the attack, had studied at Harvard University and served as a naval attaché in Washington, giving him intimate knowledge of American naval capabilities and psychology. He understood that Japan's only hope for victory in a prolonged conflict with the United States lay in delivering a devastating blow that would cripple the Pacific Fleet and buy precious time for Japanese forces to consolidate their conquests across Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Captain Minoru Genda, the tactical mastermind behind the attack plan, had insisted on using shallow-running torpedoes specifically modified for Pearl Harbor's relatively shallow 45-foot depth. The technical challenges had seemed insurmountable at first, but Japanese engineers had developed wooden fins that would allow the torpedoes to run at depths of just 12 feet, making them deadly effective against ships moored in the harbor. As Fuchida's formation approached Oahu, the commander could see the distinctive silhouette of Diamond Head Crater rising from the island's southeastern shore. The sight confirmed their navigation was perfect, and he felt a surge of pride in his pilot's skill and dedication. These men had trained relentlessly for this moment, practicing torpedo runs and dive-bombing techniques until they could execute them flawlessly, even under combat stress. Back at Pearl Harbor, Lieutenant Commander Logan Ramsey's unease was growing stronger. The approaching aircraft formation was now clearly visible, and something about their configuration troubled him. The planes appeared to be in attack formation rather than the loose grouping typical of friendly aircraft arriving at a base. He reached for his binoculars and focused on the lead aircraft, trying to identify their markings. At the Opana Point radar station, Private Lockard finally decided to call the information center. He spoke with Lieutenant Kermit Tyler, who was on duty as the pursuit officer. Tyler, with limited radar experience, assumed the large formation was a flight of Boeing B-17 Flying Fortresses expected to arrive from California that morning. "Don't worry about it," Tyler told Lockard, a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Historical documentation from the Pearl Harbor National Memorial indicates that this miscommunication represented one of several intelligence failures that contributed to the surprise nature of the attack. Aboard the USS Arizona, Seaman Rasmussen was helping prepare for the 8 o'clock morning color ceremony when he noticed unusual activity in the sky to the north. Several other sailors had gathered at the ship's rail, pointing and commenting on what appeared to be an extensive flight training exercise. The formations looked impressive, and some of the younger sailors expressed envy at what they assumed were pilots getting flight time on a Sunday morning. Commander Fuchida checked his watch. 7:49 a.m. The timing was crucial, as the attack had been planned to begin at 8 o'clock sharp, when most of the American personnel would be at breakfast or attending Sunday morning religious services. Intelligence reports had indicated that the majority of the Pacific Fleet would be in port on weekends, making Sunday morning an ideal time to achieve maximum damage with minimum resistance. As the first wave crossed over the island's northern shore, Fuchida could see Pearl Harbor spread out below him like a detailed model. The sight exceeded his most optimistic expectations. Battleship Row was filled with targets. The aircraft at Hickam Field and Wheeler Field were parked wingtip to wingtip in neat rows, and there was no sign of American fighters rising to meet them. The element of surprise was complete. Fuchida raised his signal flare and fired a single shot, the predetermined signal for his pilots to begin their attack runs. As the flare burst in the morning sky, he spoke the words that would echo through history. "Tora, Tora, Tora," the code phrase meaning tiger, tiger, tiger. That confirmed the attack was proceeding as planned, and that complete surprise had been achieved. The fate of Pearl Harbor, and America's entry into World War II, now hung in the balance as 183 Japanese aircraft began their deadly descent toward the unsuspecting naval base below. At exactly 7:55 a.m., the first Japanese torpedo struck the USS Oklahoma with a thunderous explosion that shattered the Sunday morning calm. Seaman Rasmussen felt the deck of the USS Arizona shudder beneath his feet as the shockwave rolled across the harbor. The sound was unlike anything he had ever heard. A deep, resonating boom that seemed to come from the very bowels of the earth itself. Confusion spread across the faces of his shipmates as they tried to comprehend what was happening. "Commander." Fuchida's torpedo bombers swept in low across the harbor, their engines screaming as they released their deadly cargo at Battleship Row. The USS West Virginia took multiple torpedo hits in rapid succession, causing the massive warship to list heavily to port. Captain Bennion, still on the bridge, grabbed the ship's intercom and began shouting orders to his crew, his voice carrying the authority of a career naval officer, even as his ship was dying beneath him. Lieutenant Commander Ramsey watched in horror as the reality of the situation became clear. These were not American aircraft conducting a training exercise. They were enemy bombers bearing the distinctive red circle of the Japanese Imperial Navy. He rushed to the nearest telephone and placed the call that would alert the world. Air Raid Pearl Harbor. This is not a drill. Air Raid Pearl Harbor. This is not a drill. The USS Arizona became the target of high-level bombers attacking from 14,000 feet. Armor-piercing bombs, converted from naval artillery shells, plummeted toward the battleship's forward magazines. At 8:06 a.m., a bomb penetrated the ship's deck and detonated in the forward ammunition storage area. The explosion was so massive that it lifted the Arizona's forward section completely out of the water before the ship broke in half and sank in less than 9 minutes. Seaman Rasmussen found himself thrown against a bulkhead by the tremendous blast. The young sailor from Minnesota struggled to his feet, his ears ringing and his vision blurred by smoke and debris. Around him, his shipmates were crying out for help, some trapped beneath twisted metal, others severely burned by the intense heat that had swept across the ship. The sweet smell of tropical flowers had been replaced by the acrid stench of burning oil and cordite. According to survivor accounts documented by the Naval History and Heritage Command, the explosion of the USS Arizona was visible from miles away and created a mushroom cloud that rose over 1,000 feet into the air. At Wheeler Field, Second Lieutenant George Welch and Second Lieutenant Kenneth Taylor were finishing breakfast when they heard the sounds of explosions coming from Pearl Harbor. Initially thinking it was another Navy exercise, they quickly realized the truth when Japanese fighters began strafing their airfield. The two pilots ran to their parked aircraft, determined to get airborne and fight back against the attackers. The USS Oklahoma continued taking torpedo hits, eventually capsizing completely and trapping over 400 sailors inside her hull. Nearby, the USS Utah, an older battleship being used as a target ship, also capsized after taking multiple torpedo strikes. The harbor was becoming a scene of unprecedented destruction as Japanese dive bombers screamed down from above, their sirens wailing like banshees as they targeted ships and installations throughout the base. Admiral Kimmel stood at the window of his headquarters, watching his fleet being systematically destroyed. The career naval officer, who had dedicated his life to building American naval strength in the Pacific, could only observe helplessly as years of preparation and training were being undone in a matter of minutes. A spent bullet crashed through the window, landing at his feet, a stark reminder of how completely the Japanese had achieved surprise. At Hickam Field, the Army Air Force's base adjacent to Pearl Harbor, Japanese fighters were systematically destroying American aircraft lined up in neat rows on the tarmac. The planes had been positioned to guard against sabotage, but this defensive measure made them perfect targets for the attacking aircraft. Explosions rippled across the airfield as fuel tanks erupted and ammunition began cooking off in the intense heat. Captain Bennion remained at his post on the USS West Virginia's bridge, even as his ship continued to take hits. The veteran officer coordinated damage control efforts and supervised the evacuation of wounded sailors, refusing medical attention for his own injuries. His executive officer, Commander Roscoe Hillencutter, attempted to convince him to abandon the bridge, but Bennion insisted on remaining with his ship until the last possible moment. Commander Fuchida circled above the harbor, coordinating the attack and assessing the damage being inflicted by his aircraft. The results exceeded even his most optimistic projections. The American Pacific Fleet was being systematically destroyed, and there was virtually no organized resistance. A few anti-aircraft guns were beginning to respond, sending streams of tracer bullets into the sky, but the majority of the base's defenders were still struggling to understand what was happening. As the first wave of the attack reached its climax, Pearl Harbor had been transformed from a peaceful naval base into a hellscape of burning ships, exploding ammunition, and desperate sailors fighting for their lives. The surprise attack that Admiral Yamamoto had envisioned was succeeding beyond his wildest dreams, and America's entry into World War II was now inevitable. As the USS Arizona continued to burn with an intensity that seemed to melt the very air around it, Hospital Corpsman Third Class Johnny Johnson dove into the oil-covered waters of Pearl Harbor to rescue survivors. The young medic from Alabama had been preparing for Sunday morning church services when the attack began, but now he found himself swimming through a nightmare of burning fuel and debris, pulling wounded sailors to safety on Ford Island. The second wave of Japanese aircraft, consisting of 170 planes under the command of Lieutenant Commander Shigekazu Shimazaki, arrived at 8:54 a.m. to find Pearl Harbor already shrouded in thick black smoke. The dive bombers and fighters in this wave focused their attention on ships that had escaped damage in the first attack, as well as the repair facilities and fuel storage tanks that were critical to the base's operations. Lieutenant George Welch and Lieutenant Kenneth Taylor had managed to reach Halewa Airfield, where they found two Curtiss P-40 Warhawk fighters that had escaped the initial strafing attacks. Without waiting for orders or proper authorization, the two pilots took off and engaged the Japanese aircraft in aerial combat. Welch shot down 4 enemy planes that morning, while Taylor downed 2, becoming the first American pilots to achieve victories against the Japanese in World War II. Military records from the Air Force Historical Research Agency confirm that Welch and Taylor's unauthorized flight represented one of the few organized American responses during the attack. On Ford Island, Chief Aviation Ordnanceman John Finn had set up a machine gun in an exposed position and was firing at Japanese aircraft, despite being wounded multiple times. The chief petty officer, who would later receive the Medal of Honor for his actions, continued to man his position throughout the entire attack, inspiring other sailors to organize defensive positions and fight back against the overwhelming enemy force. The USS Nevada, the only battleship to get underway during the attack, was attempting to reach the harbor entrance when Japanese dive bombers concentrated their efforts on sinking her in the narrow channel. Realizing that a sunken ship would block the harbor entrance and trap the remaining fleet, the Nevada's commanding officer deliberately ran his ship aground on Hospital Point, preventing a complete blockade of Pearl Harbor. Captain Bennion, still at his post on the USS West Virginia, despite suffering mortal wounds from shrapnel, continued to direct his crew's efforts to save their ship. The captain's calm leadership under extreme duress helped organize damage control parties that prevented the West Virginia from capsizing. Like the Oklahoma, his final orders were to ensure that all wounded personnel were evacuated before the ship was abandoned. Aboard the capsized USS Oklahoma, sailors trapped in the inverted hull were tapping on the bulkheads to signal their locations to rescue parties on the surface. Shipfitter First Class Julio de Castro led a group of volunteers who used cutting torches to burn through the ship's hull, eventually rescuing 32 men who had been trapped in air pockets inside the overturned battleship. The destruction was not limited to ships and aircraft. The Japanese attack also targeted critical infrastructure throughout Oahu. At Schofield Barracks, the largest army installation on the island, soldiers were diving for cover as Japanese fighters strafed the barracks and administrative buildings. Many of the soldiers were still in their pajamas, having been awakened by the sound of explosions from Pearl Harbor. Seaman Rasmussen, having survived the initial explosion on the Arizona, found himself helping to fight fires on nearby ships. The young sailor had become separated from his unit in the chaos, but he joined any group that needed assistance, carrying ammunition to anti-aircraft guns and helping to evacuate wounded personnel from damaged vessels. The boy from Minnesota had discovered reserves of courage he never knew he possessed. At the Army's Wheeler Field, ground crews were desperately trying to salvage undamaged aircraft and get them airborne. Major General Frederick Martin, commanding general of the Hawaiian Air Force, had arrived at the field to find most of his aircraft destroyed or damaged. However, a few pilots managed to take off in whatever planes were still flyable, determined to engage the enemy regardless of the odds against them. The USS Pennsylvania, flagship of the Pacific Fleet, was in dry dock when the attack began and escaped the worst of the damage inflicted on Battleship Row. However, the destroyers USS Kassan and USS Downs, which were in the same dry dock, were hit by bombs and caught fire. The intense heat caused their ammunition to explode, creating a spectacular fireworks display that could be seen throughout the base. Commander Fuchida, observing the second wave's attack from above, was amazed by the fierce resistance that was beginning to develop. American anti-aircraft fire was becoming more accurate and organized, and he could see several of his aircraft trailing smoke as they headed back toward the carrier fleet. The element of surprise had been lost, but the damage to the American Pacific Fleet was already catastrophic. As the morning wore on, individual acts of heroism became commonplace throughout Pearl Harbor. Sailors risked their lives to rescue shipmates, medics treated the wounded under enemy fire, and officers maintained discipline and organization despite the chaos surrounding them. These acts of courage would become the foundation of America's eventual victory in the Pacific War. By 10 o'clock that morning, the last Japanese aircraft had disappeared over the northern horizon, leaving behind a scene of devastation that would forever change the course of world history. Pearl Harbor, once the proud symbol of American naval power in the Pacific, now resembled a graveyard of twisted metal and burning ships. The acrid smoke rising from the harbor could be seen for miles, creating a black pall that seemed to darken the entire island of Oahu. Admiral Kimmel walked through the ruins of his fleet with the bearing of a man who had aged decades in the span of 2 hours. The USS Arizona continued to burn, her superstructure a twisted monument to the 1,100 sailors and Marines who had perished when her forward magazines exploded. The USS Oklahoma lay capsized, her hull rising from the water like the back of a sleeping whale, while rescue crews worked frantically to cut through her steel plates to reach survivors trapped inside. The human cost of the attack was becoming horrifyingly clear as casualty reports arrived at the base hospital. 2,403 Americans had been killed, including 68 civilians caught in the crossfire. Another 1,178 had been wounded, many suffering from severe burns inflicted by the intense fires that had swept across the harbor. The hospital staff, overwhelmed by the number of casualties, had converted every available space into treatment areas. Seaman Rasmussen sat on a pile of debris near the water's edge, his white uniform now blackened with oil and soot. The young sailor from Minnesota stared at the burning wreckage of the Arizona, where many of his friends and shipmates lay entombed beneath tons of twisted steel. The boy who had joined the Navy to see the world and serve his country had witnessed the transformation of his peaceful harbor into a scene from hell itself. Historical analysis by the Naval War College indicates that the Japanese attack achieved tactical success but failed in its strategic objective of preventing American entry into World War II. News of the attack spread rapidly across the mainland United States, transmitted by radio and telegraph to a nation that had been enjoying a peaceful Sunday morning. In Washington, D.C., Secretary of State Cordell Hull was meeting with Japanese Ambassador Kichisaburo Nomura and Special Envoy Saburo Kurusu when word of the attack arrived. Hull's face turned pale as he read the message, and he looked up at the Japanese diplomats with barely controlled rage. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt was having lunch at the White House when Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox called with the first reports from Pearl Harbor. The president, who had been working desperately to keep America out of the expanding World War, immediately understood that the Japanese attack had made American neutrality impossible. He began drafting the speech he would deliver to Congress the following day, knowing that it would be a declaration of war. The Japanese strike force, under the command of Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, was already heading back toward Japan when reports of the attack's success reached the flagship Akagi. Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of the operation, received the news with mixed emotions. While the tactical success exceeded his expectations, he understood that Japan had awakened a sleeping giant whose industrial capacity and determination would ultimately prove overwhelming. Back at Pearl Harbor, the grim work of rescue and recovery continued throughout the day and into the night. Salvage teams worked by floodlight to cut through the hull of the Oklahoma, hoping to reach more survivors trapped in the capsized battleship. The hospital ship USS Solace, which had escaped damage during the attack, served as a floating medical facility for the most seriously wounded casualties. Lieutenant Commander Ramsey, whose quick thinking had alerted the base to the attack, was now coordinating damage assessment reports for Admiral Kimmel's staff. The destruction was even more extensive than it had appeared during the attack itself. 8 battleships had been damaged or destroyed, along with 3 cruisers, 3 destroyers, and 1 mine layer. The Army Air Forces had lost 188 aircraft, while the Navy had lost 159 planes. The psychological impact of the attack extended far beyond the physical destruction. For the first time since the War of 1812, foreign aircraft had successfully attacked American territory, shattering the sense of security that had allowed the United States to remain isolated from the world's conflicts. The attack had demonstrated America's vulnerability and the global reach of modern warfare. Commander Fuchida, leading his aircraft back to the carrier fleet, reflected on the morning's events with professional satisfaction, tempered by personal concern. While the attack had achieved its immediate objectives, he wondered whether Japan possessed the resources to sustain a prolonged conflict with the United States. The American industrial capacity was legendary, and he feared that his nation had started a war it could not finish. As darkness fell over Pearl Harbor, the fires continued to burn on several ships, casting an eerie glow across the water. The base that had awakened that morning as a symbol of American naval power in the Pacific had been transformed into a testament to the destructive capabilities of modern warfare. The attack on Pearl Harbor had ended, but its consequences would reshape the world for generations to come. The morning of December 8, 1941, dawned gray and somber over Washington, D.C., as President Franklin Delano Roosevelt prepared to address a joint session of Congress. The president, who had spent the previous evening consulting with his military advisors and congressional leaders, knew that his words would formally bring the United States into the greatest conflict in human history. The text of his speech lay before him on his desk, carefully crafted to capture the nation's outrage, while maintaining the dignity befitting a declaration of war. At Pearl Harbor, the work of rescue and recovery continued under the direction of Rear Admiral William Furlong, who had assumed command of the base's salvage operations. The harbor remained cloaked in smoke from ships that were still burning more than 24 hours after the attack. Divers were working in the murky waters around the capsized Oklahoma, desperately searching for air pockets where survivors might still be trapped. Seaman Rasmussen had volunteered for one of the rescue teams cutting through the Oklahoma's hull. The young sailor from Minnesota worked alongside experienced shipfitters and welders, using acetylene torches to burn through steel plates while listening for tapping sounds that might indicate survivors below. The work was dangerous and exhausting, but every man involved understood that American lives hung in the balance. The Japanese strike force was now well on its way back to Japan, having successfully withdrawn without losing a single aircraft carrier. Admiral Nagumo had rejected recommendations from some of his subordinates to launch a third wave of attacks targeting Pearl Harbor's fuel storage facilities and dry docks. This decision would later be criticized by military historians as a missed opportunity that allowed the American Pacific Fleet to recover more quickly than it otherwise might have. According to documents from the Franklin D. Roosevelt Presidential Library, the president's speech underwent multiple revisions as reports continued to arrive from Pearl Harbor throughout December 7th and 8th. In Tokyo, Emperor Hirohito was receiving detailed reports of the attack's success from Admiral Yamamoto and other military leaders. While pleased with the tactical results, the emperor privately harbored concerns about Japan's ability to sustain a prolonged conflict with the United States. The decision to attack Pearl Harbor had been made with the understanding that Japan needed to achieve decisive victories quickly, before American industrial capacity could be fully mobilized for war. At 12:36 p.m. Eastern Time, President Roosevelt entered the House chamber to address Congress and the American people. His famous words would echo through history. Yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The president's voice carried the weight of a nation's determination as he requested that Congress declare a state of war between the United States and Japan. The congressional response was swift and overwhelming. The Senate voted 82-0 in favor of war, while the House of Representatives approved the declaration by a margin of 388-1. Representative Jeanette Rankin of Montana cast the lone dissenting vote, maintaining her pacifist principles even in the face of national crisis. Within hours of the president's speech, America was officially at war. Captain Bennian's sacrifice on the USS West Virginia had become symbolic of the courage displayed throughout Pearl Harbor during the attack. The captain had remained at his post until the end, ensuring that his crew was evacuated before succumbing to his wounds. His Medal of Honor citation would read, in part, that he had fought his ship with greatest gallantry until he was killed in action, representing the highest traditions of naval service. The attack on Pearl Harbor had achieved Japan's immediate tactical objectives, but had failed catastrophically in its strategic purpose. Rather than deterring American involvement in the Pacific War, the surprise attack had unified the American people in a way that years of diplomatic tension had never accomplished. The isolationist movement, which had been a powerful force in American politics throughout the 1930s, was effectively destroyed in the space of 2 hours on a Sunday morning in Hawaii. Admiral Kimmel and General Walter Short, the Army commander in Hawaii, would both be relieved of their commands within days of the attack. While investigations would later reveal systematic intelligence failures at multiple levels of the American military hierarchy, the two commanders bore the immediate responsibility for the unpreparedness that had made the Japanese surprise attack possible. The salvage operations at Pearl Harbor would continue for months, eventually succeeding in raising and repairing most of the damaged ships. The USS Arizona, however, would remain on the harbor bottom as a permanent memorial to the men who died during the attack. The battleship's superstructure would be removed, but her hull would become the foundation for a memorial that would honor not only the Pearl Harbor casualties, but all Americans who served in World War II. Seaman Rasmussen would survive the war, serving aboard various ships in the Pacific Theater as American forces fought their way across the ocean toward Japan itself. The young sailor from Minnesota would participate in the battles of Midway, Guadalcanal, and the Philippines, carrying with him the memory of that December morning when his peaceful world had been shattered by the realities of global warfare. The attack on Pearl Harbor had accomplished something that years of diplomatic efforts had failed to achieve. It had brought the United States fully into World War II with a unity of purpose that would prove unstoppable. The surprise strike that was intended to cripple American naval power had instead awakened the industrial and military giant whose determination would ultimately bring about Japan's unconditional surrender and reshape the global balance of power for generations to come.